Welcome to Grounded with John Tester and Maritza Giorgio. Hey there, Senator. How was your weekend?
That was good. Yeah, it was good. I got stuck in some weather and didn't get home till 4:30 in the morning on Saturday morning. But other than that, it was fine. It's fine, you know. It's
Fine.
the way it is. Time to spare, go by air, I guess. But it's better than walking.
Fine is Tester's new way to tease me because where I come from, fine is like, oh no, you're in trouble. If someone says it's fine, but so now we're in this game. It's fine.
Yeah, well, it is. It's fine. It's fine.
All right, say we have a really big show today. This is the first time we're going to try this. We are recording this version of the intro right now of this show, and then we are hopping over to Substack Live to do our live conversation with Heather Cox Richardson, who's just kind of a legend in the United States as far as her way of explaining things, explaining current events, how they relate in our nation's history and our world's history, and doing so in a really calm way. And that's something that we try to do here. And I'm just so excited for the conversation. And then once we wrap it up live on Substack, it will be all beautifully uh, edited into this. And if you're listening to this on your podcasts, it's all over by now. But tell me about when you first met or knew about Heather Cox Richardson.
So you're going to merge these two events, this pre-recording now and the live cast we're doing on Substack. You through the technology genius that you have, we're going to merge those.
Yes, it's a very sophisticated team we have here.
Perfect.
I'll call it two and a half of us because it's you, me, and neighbor John who helps with some audio at the end. So it's
And
a very, very sophisticated team.
normally, this is true, I would assume that I'm the half, right?
I'm not even going to say. I won't
Okay,
say.
good, perfect. Anyway, what was your question before I took us down that rabbit hole?
Oh,
Uh,
so when did Heather Cox Richardson
oh,
first come on your radar?
through her newsletters. I had people that I knew in the state and everywhere actually talking about this lady who wrote really pretty common sense, grounded things about what's going on that people could relate with, and that's where I first heard of her. And then, of course, she had come in, I think, several times and spoke to the caucus. I remember one specifically in the last year she came in. It seems like it was in the last year and visited, but I think it was even more than that. Anyway, my good friend Angus King knows her very well. She's married to a lobsterman in Maine, and she's well, I mean, she's one of the best thinkers, and I don't classify her as being a Democrat or a Republican. I think she's very much sees it and calls it as it is, which is pretty cool. And so she's a good person. She's smart as hell.
Oh, she's so smart and smart in a way that doesn't I mean, I'm intimidated in this moment as we prepare for her interview, but she doesn't present information in a way that's intimidating, which I love. And it's just so accessible and easy to understand. And she explains things in a way that's really simple, which really we need more of. So we are very, very excited for this conversation. Let's talk about some headlines though, because it was a wild weekend. Wow. We have this ongoing unrest in Los Angeles. This morning, President Trump put out this message saying, looking really bad in LA, bring in the troops in all caps. Governor Gavin Newsom says the state's actually going to sue President Trump. That's because the president deployed the National Guard to LA over the weekend against the will of Newsom and LA's Mayor Karen Bass. Now, massive protests and unrest started after immigration raids in that city. Trump's border czar told NBC News that ICE officials arrested about 150 undocumented immigrants. And then he also threatened the governor and mayor with arrests if they get in the way. And now Governor Newsom got pretty emotional in a clip I saw and basically said, bring it, come and get it, arrest me, but leave these people alone.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I don't think it's a secret right now if you take a look at it. The president is going to approach from a standpoint that he's trying to obey the law and get rid of illegal immigrants, which is part of what he ran on, and a good part of it. The challenge here, from my perspective, is that why not let the state handle it? If the state can't handle it, then we've got another situation. I'm talking about the violence now, and and move forth from there. But I think that to go and have the federal government Bigfoot the state out of the road is a bad precedent, and it it has real long term impacts on all sorts of different issues, and I it's pretty bad. But I can tell you that people have said, and I agree, the president's been looking for this opportunity. You got a guy who's potentially running for president in 4 years, 3.5 years in a blue state, and he gets a chance to fight with a political opponent. I don't know who lit the cars on fire that I saw in the news last night. I don't know if it was protesters or if it was who it was. But those are great optics to say, we're going to bring in the National Guard and I'm going to control them. The state isn't, and I'm going to do what the hell I want. And I don't really care what the state of California has to say about it. It's a really bad precedent. It's a really bad precedent. And
And I think they know that if they're, we've seen this play out before where there are a handful of agitators, right?
yeah,
But when you look at the size of the actual crowd,
yeah,
reporters down there saying almost, I saw blocks of people just sitting.
yeah,
And so they know that if there's a fire, the news cameras are going to go to the
yeah.
fire. And
That's right.
it's scary looking and I get that. And
Yeah,
nobody's condoning violence or saying
absolutely not.
that's okay, but I the point is that the cameras capture the chaos and the protesters sitting down peacefully outside the detention center are just not as sexy when you cover news stories, and I think it's an important part of this conversation.
Yeah, I talked to a guy last night whose son was down there, a peaceful protest. He wasn't doing anything. They were just standing, I believe it was a courthouse they were standing by, and they got sprayed with rubber bullets. And they were just standing there. They weren't doing anything. They didn't even have signs. They just were trying to make their voices heard. It's a challenge, man. It's a challenge. We knew. I tell you what, everybody knew it was coming, and I've heard talked to a lot of folks say, "Well, we need to protest." There is concern out there that he will use the military in different ways than it's ever been used before, and you guys can fill in the blanks on that. But the bottom line, he's already done this. I think this is the first time in what 60 years or longer that the president has overruled the governor of a state and said, "I don't care what you think. I'm going to do what I want to do." So tough shit, and that's what he's done. And I think it's a bad precedent.
And Heather Cox Richardson, I hope to talk to her about this. We have a long list, though, as you are probably anticipating.
I don't doubt that a bit. You have no doubt.
But, she made this point in her letter last night that about that bipartisan immigration bill that was ready to go,
Yeah,
and people were in support of it, and then candidate Trump said, "No, I need to campaign on this,"
yeah.
and it died. So, it's just, that's another piece to this that we need to keep in the conversation, I think.
Yep, that's true. I mean, it's I don't know. It's politics. There's look. I mean, on one hand, if folks broke the law, then they should be sent back to the country they're coming from. But he's doing much more than that. I mean, he's stopping student visas. He's kicking all the Chinese out of the country, which is crazy. Just carte blanche. It's bullshit. And I mean, if we'd have done this after World War II, there would have been no Manhattan Project. They kicked all the Germans out, and that was the folks who did it. There are folks here from other countries that want to be here because they don't like dictatorships. They want to be free, and and they follow the rules. They get here, they get their green card, they get their visa, they get all this stuff, and then they get booted out because they got a different skin color. They talk about. I don't know. I don't get it. It's not the country I was raised in. I'll just tell you that.
Really great point. So speaking of folks from other countries, we have another travel ban that went into effect Monday. President Trump banning citizens from 12 countries from coming into the US, and then more restrictions on people from 7 other countries, not all out bans, but restrictions. He says this is about security concerns, and he's trying to use that terrorist attack that we saw in Colorado to justify this. The man charged in those horrific crimes, though, he's from Egypt, and that is not a country on this list.
Well, I mean, the facts don't mean a lot, and whether it was what was going on in South Africa when he brought the South African president in and had a bunch of stuff that was not true. He presented to the South African president and assumed the South African president would just accept it because he said it. When he said, no, I don't know where this is happening. It's not even anywhere I'm aware of. Or, not knowing what happened on D-Day. I mean, really? You don't know what happened on D-Day? I mean, a man that's 78 years old. I mean, I get it if you're 13, 14 years old, might not be big on your list, but it will
Well,
be as you get older.
my son knows all about D-Day. He's
Yeah, well, I mean,
fascinated by D-Day.
I'm not making excuses for anybody, but somebody that has lived their entire life and seen what those people did and freed Europe didn't know about it. So, yeah, I mean, he's going to use any excuse he can do to have an agenda to make this country into what he thinks it should be. And I mean, the whole thing about firing people and say we're going to hire patriotic people, and his definition of patriotic people is the people that have his political view. I mean, you know, take a look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I don't know if he even knows what those are. He said he isn't going to live with the Constitution. He doesn't. I heard yesterday there was a person who brought in the Declaration of Independence and asked me about it. I said, "Well, it's a nice declaration.
That's that's
It's long. It's long. You know."
that's not just somebody. It was Terry Moran in his in the Oval Office where he hung the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to talk about him in a second, but I do want to ask you about this feud. Oh, I knocked my microphone. This feud, we talked a little bit about it in a live episode here over the weekend, I think it was. I
Yeah, it was over the
remember what
weekend.
yeah, but, President Trump now threatening serious consequences if Elon Musk starts sending his money to Democratic candidates who vote against the big, beautiful bill. So, what are those consequences? Well, who knows? We don't know. But the president told NBC News he has no plans to make up with Musk after that just insane display of social media squabbling and accusations. And meanwhile, your buddy, Cory Booker, was on Meet the Press this weekend. He says he doesn't have any plans to accept any of that ex-Tesla SpaceX money.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's what happens. You have two guys with huge egos that have, a lot of money. When you have a guy that he led around the Capitol threatening people that if they voted against nominees to his cabinet, that he would primary them. Now they've broken up. Um, but going back to the Constitution, Elon Musk has the right, as long as he follows the law, the laws that are out there, which, by the way, is questionable when it comes to campaigns, especially after what he did in Wisconsin. But follows the law, he can give money to whoever the hell he wants. I mean, that's part of the freedoms we have in this country. Um, I will be shocked if he supports Democrats, and hell, I might even be shocked if he supports Republicans who support the bill. That, by the way, Elon Musk and I don't agree on a lot of things, but we do agree that that bill's a bad bill, and it should be taken back and reworked and brought back so it works for working families and regular folks instead of the uber rich. And it does something with the debt, by the way, because it needs to. Our bond markets are in trouble. So there's all sorts of stuff going on, but it's what happens when you bring in an immigrant from South Africa and give him the keys to Washington, D.C., and say, tear apart government, which is what Bannon wants them to do. And he did it. He got all the information he needed for his business, and then they get into a fight. Um, I don't know.
Big fight.
It's why we have government agencies that are not politicized. Unfortunately, everything's being politicized at this moment in time.
Okay, so let's get back to Terry Moran.
Yeah.
This is the ABC News senior correspondent. He's been around for a long time. Well, ABC News suspended him over the weekend. He was the one who had that notable interview with President Trump in the Oval Office when they talked about the Declaration of Independence, but also when Trump tried to say that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, that Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador to the Supermax prison, that he had the MS-13 tattoo on his knuckles. And Terry Moran said, no, no, that's photoshopped. That's fake. So there was a back and forth. Well, he was suspended after Moran criticized Trump and his aide Stephen Miller on X over the weekend. He called both Miller and Trump world-class haters, and he said, "What's interesting about Miller isn't brains, it's bile." Now, I have a lot of thoughts about this. What do you think?
I think ABC News needs to pull their head out of their ass. I mean, you've got a guy that he didn't threaten anybody. He just pulled it, called it like he saw it, and he gets suspended, or did he get fired? I don't know. He got suspended.
Suspended, yeah.
Yeah, so he didn't get fired yet. But what's the new? I mean, I was in the United States Senate. I was in the state legislature. I was on a school board. The press has a job to call you out and make you defend yourself, make you defend your actions. You shouldn't get suspended for that. That's the fear factor that has come about over the last 10 years, and it's not good for the democracy. I'll just tell you, if you don't have a free press, if people are able to speak their minds, that's what the hell's the difference between us and any other dictatorship then?
Well, and I go back to journalism school on this one because, we are taught about expressing opinions and appearing unbiased, but anymore, the world of journalism has changed, and we see people all the time. Look at how polarized, our cable news channels have become, and
Yeah,
so yeah, this is a tricky one for me to kind of wade through, but we'd love to hear what you think about it, and you can
I
reach.
don't. I gotta tell you, Maurice, I don't think it's tricky at all.
Oh,
This guy, I mean, he worked for ABC News. Does that mean he can't express his opinion anymore? That's part of the contract. I mean, I don't get it. And roll the clock back 3, 4 years. If he'd have done the same thing to Joe Biden and Steve Ricchetti, would he have gotten laid off? I doubt it very, very much.
he may have, though. I mean, there are, like, in my contracts, I wish I had one up to read the language, but there are parts of broadcast contracts, at least, that talk about, social media and what you put out there. Like, that is part of a contract sometimes. So,
I got it if you're threatening people, but
yeah.
what did he say again? It was so
He said
bad.
he said he called them both world-class haters and said, "What's interesting about Miller isn't brains, it's bile."
I don't know. We'll let the listeners deal with it.
We'll have to yeah, we'd love to hear what you think. For me, it's tricky. I get from where you're sitting from, it's not tricky, but for me, it's tricky only because I've signed a lot of those contracts that say you don't post this stuff on social media. So that is one that I think we'll hear probably a lot about. Well, for the people listening on podcasts or on YouTube, we are going to. Oh, there we go. We are going to seg into our interview now with Heather Cox Richardson, and we hope you enjoy it. Now, we want to welcome you to our very first grounded Substack live show with the incredible Dr. Heather Cox Richardson joining us for this first endeavor. We hope you are all patient with us because this is very new to us. But Heather's a historian, a professor, basically a source of calm for so many of us in a period of just absolute chaos and information overload. And so, Heather, we're just so thankful you're here. Former Senator Tester and I have so much we want to talk to you about, and we should let our viewers know here as they join. The senator is going to have to hop off a little bit early, but I'm going to ask a lot of your questions here once he leaves. So great to see you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's gonna be totally fun.
It's good to have you on, Heather. I want to get right after it here. We'll dive right in, do a deep dive. What keeps you up at night?
keeps me up at night? Well, there's a lot going on in our country right now that's not real positive. What we saw over the weekend with the administration trying to start an escalated fight in Los Angeles with the Democratic states, especially with the destruction of the rule of law, with the overreach over Congress, all of those things add up to a really ugly picture. So there's a lot to be worried about right now.
We saw what happened in LA. We've seen the governor say, we can handle this. We've seen the president say, take a hike. I'm going to do what I want to do because I really think he's doing it for political purposes. Just like he upheld, like he upended the bill that we had last spring for political purposes. So do we just? I mean, does the country just have to, deal with it? I mean, there's nothing we can do about it, or is there something the governor can do about it, or the mayor, or anybody, or is it just this is the way it is? He's gonna utilize them how he sees them, and he's gonna get a lot of supporters because of it. I'll tell you that, quite frankly, he'll get a lot of supporters what he did in L.A. because people see this as lawlessness and they don't want it to happen.
So I'm going to push back on that because one of the things that I think we've done over the last 40 years is the American people have forgotten their agency. They have forgotten that this is our country. And this administration has really tried to do an end run around us by acting sort of extra constitutionally as if there isn't a constitution. And to the degree that Americans step up and say, no, this is not what we want. We don't want people who are in this country legally to be caught up in these sweeps and rendered to prisons in third world countries, or I'm sorry, in third countries. That's a very real thing. But defining what's happening is going to be really important. And we know that there is this right wing media that has swept up a lot of people. And the fact that you're doing this now to push back, I think is really important because what's happening in LA is only a really small piece of what's going on. And I actually think if you look at it, it is a reflection of how unpopular this administration is, not how popular it is. So it's underwater on tariffs. It's underwater on the economy. It's actually underwater on immigration. It's certainly underwater on the Department of Government Efficiency. This blow up between Trump and Musk was hideously embarrassing for everybody involved. And you can see this attempt of the people in the administration. And I'm not at all convinced that they are being driven by Donald Trump. I think what you're seeing with the immigration stuff is really Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem really pushing that. Meaning on Saturday night, Trump was at a UFC fight club, right? Or maybe it was Friday night while all this was transpiring. So the degree to which Americans speak up and say this is not the country we want, I think is going to be how we define going forward and how we actually recover democracy under what is really sort of a hapless administration.
So, and excuse me, Maritza, but I got to follow up. So you probably get them. I get them. I get emails every day. I get phone calls at home saying, how do we respond? How do I make my voice heard? I don't know how to make my voice heard. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about the big reconciliation bill, or if you're talking about tariffs, or you're talking about doing away with Trio, whatever it might be. So how do you do that? I mean, I
Well,
tell them to write their congressman, and if they get a response back, somebody's reading the damn thing, even if it isn't a response that is to their question. But is there other ways to do it other than just the basic send out an email or call the office?
I think there is. And I want to actually go back to what's happening in Montana and what's happening across the West, which is a huge deal where you are, less so where I am. But so many people are not aware of the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, who was the governor of North Dakota, has turned over the Interior Department to somebody from the Department of Government Efficiency. And part of what they are charged with doing is selling off the public lands. And in the president's upcoming budget, there is an attempt to sell off national parks and national monuments. That's really unpopular. It's also not economically viable. And that's actually what your Senate campaign was all about. That sort of message has real teeth, I think, in places where they might not think they care about tariffs, even though they really do. But so what ordinary people can do, is to leverage the same kind of tools that we're doing here short videos explaining how the cuts to the National Institutes of Health is affecting your cancer treatment. One of the things that's really big for me, my husband is a commercial fisherman, and every morning he gets up to see how high the waves are because I don't know, his life depends on it. So the idea that they're cutting NOAA and the National Weather Service is bonkers. And the pushback that they've gotten on that, of course, has meant that they're rehiring people. So to the degree that you can push as ordinary people, you can push back on the lies and you can flood the social media zone with the things you care about. In addition to getting involved locally, in addition to getting involved at the state level, in addition to calling your national Congress critters and the officials, the more you can do that, the more you can change the ship of state, because what really matters in the United States is popular opinion. And the way we take over popular opinion is by reinforcing a reality based public debate and by saying, hey, listen, this stuff really matters to me.
So, Heather, I mean, I heard this great metaphor you used when describing why people are so hungry for power and why they do what they do. And it was kind of this whole 10-person thing, and you had two at the top who wanted to control the group. And it really comes down to storytelling and retaking the narrative and retaking the story. But it's really hard to do right now with social media, with misinformation, with the president just repeating over and over and over claims like, I keep coming back to the tattoos on that photo of Kilmar Abrego's Garcia's hand in the MS-13 Photoshop, and him saying, "No, no, that's real, that's real, that's real," to the point where nobody will debate it. No, it's the emperor has no clothes. And so how do we take back the narrative when there's so many people saying, "No, that's not true, that's fake news," or even, I know you said something in one of your recent chats about people spreading misinformation about the big beautiful bill and having, something in there about elections in it when it's not. So it happens everywhere. It happens on both sides. How do we take the narrative back and really get back to fact-based information that serves us all better?
What were you going to add something there, Senator Tester?
No, now I want you to go, and then I may intercede a little bit, but go ahead.
Okay, it's fired up.
There's a big difference between misinformation and disinformation. People make mistakes and they say things that aren't true. And, I made a big mistake in my letter last night because I edited at 4 o'clock in the morning and I forgot to fact check something. As soon as I woke up this morning, I went right back into it and I fixed it. That's just people making mistakes, and human beings do that. That's very different than what we have seen on the side of the radical right now since at least 2015, but you can actually push it all the way back into the 1980s, which is an attempt to create a false reality. And there are certainly people who are married to that false reality. There's nothing you can do to get those about 22% of people who believe that undocumented immigrants were eating people's pets. I mean, that ship has sailed. Those people are not reachable. But I think Americans or human beings in general, I study Americans, are wired to learn. They want to know what is really happening, and they're decent people. So, to the degree that we can reinforce what is real, simply by saying, actually, here's the facts with real evidence behind them, the more people gravitate toward that. And there is a huge hunger for that, even in on social media, where, for example, somebody will post. I saw this the other day. Somebody posted that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York had made millions of dollars in her position as a representative from her previous life as a bartender and working in social work. And all over that person's post, people actually responded with the congressional documents showing her actual net worth. And the person who posted that was completely unconvinced. But there were a lot of people who were reading that who almost certainly were like, yeah, he's out to lunch. And how often do you have to hear that before you stop paying attention to what that person says? So the photoshopping on the knuckles is a great example of that. Yes, I know people who anything Donald Trump says they consider gospel, although they're being very quiet lately now that there's attacks against Medicaid, for example, and the attacks that will then roll over into Medicare. But virtually anybody who is not wedded very deeply to the MAGA movement looked at that and was like, oh, come on, really? And that's actually how you tear down authoritarians, is by making fun of them, because that was just stupid. I mean, how many things does Trump say now that are just stupid? Now, the other piece of that, of course, when you tear down that false reality, is Trump is largely untouchable for a number of interesting political reasons, but the people around him are not. I mean, Musk has gone down lately, and think of Pete Hegseth, who is, a walking national security disaster. Think of Kristi Noem, who shot her dog. You think of these people around them. That's a really good place for people to be putting their attention, because those are people who are, many of them, tarred with corruption or with really wacko ideas, and who are already unpopular.
So, one of the things that I've been very, very critical of is Congress ceding not a little bit of their authority, but in my perspective, all their authority to the executive branch. Um, so, I mean, should we make it a prerequisite that they read the Constitution, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, or how do we get the Congress, particularly the Senate, by the way, to have backbone to push back against stuff that I think they know is wrong?
Well, let me throw. I actually have an idea about that, but I have to ask you. This is my big shock of this whole era. Why didn't the Republican senators protect the prerogatives of the Senate? Like, I did not see that coming. I thought they'd be like, "Yeah, you're good over there, but we're going to protect the prerogatives of the Senate." Why didn't they do it? Are they just expecting that the courts will take care of everything?
Yes,
Yes.
that's exactly it. They're expecting the courts to take care of the problem when in fact it's their responsibility. They're put in a position of leadership, and they need to lead, and they're not. They don't want to be the bad guys. I guess they don't want to get on the wrong side of Trump. Hey, let's be honest. There's a lot of really good people that didn't run for reelection, I believe, because they got on the wrong side of Donald Trump, and they're good people, and they were Republicans, and I think I just don't think that the rest of them want to. I don't know. I hate to say this, but want to give up their positions just because they push back against the president. When in fact, and you know this, Heather, Robert C. Byrd is would be going crazy right now if he was in the United States Senate, because they've given away all their power.
But it just I look at this, and I can give you times in the past in similar situations where the Republican senator who stands up and makes a stand becomes incredibly famous and in great shape to be reelected, to become even more powerful. And I do not understand why, you could throw out any number of names here, doesn't do that. I mean, at this point, what does John Cornyn have to lose? He's down 17 points in Texas.
Mm. You're
17
you're
points.
Well,
you're
it's we talk so much. Like, I have a 13-year-old son who's been bullied, and we talk so much about the bully on the playground thing, and that, it really, if everybody just rallies against the bully and says, "No, we're taking a stand. This is our line in the sand," that takes away the power. So I think that's been a question we've had. Why aren't they all kind of banding together when we know those conversations are happening on Capitol Hill behind the scenes?
I think that was to you, Senator Tester. I don't know what makes a senator tick.
No, look. I mean, like I said before, I think what my former colleagues have not seen yet is that person that stood up to him and survived. Just to be
Mhm.
everyone that stood up to him and said, "Hey," and by the way, not directly in their face. They've done it very, very professionally. Every one of those folks are no longer in the Senate. Well, maybe with the exception of a couple, by the way.
Mhm.
But come
But
on, look at Liz Cheney, who
yeah,
was kind of, I mean, she was high in the ranks, but she was not well known. And
yep.
I look at her, and it certainly looks to me as if she's keeping her powder dry for 2028. Adam Kinzinger, who had ever heard of Adam Kinzinger, who now is a major figure? There are already examples there now that, um, again, if I were a senator, which, thank all the gods I am not, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it's Margaret Chase Smith time, and poor Angus King from Maine is out there trying to do it, but he's not running for office again. So I don't know. I just
Heather. Heather, I just want to point out those people that you talked about, Liz Cheney, Kinzinger. There's a lot more on that list. They're no longer in Congress,
No,
and
but
and so
they're
they
leaders.
that I agree they're leaders, but the truth is their platform to lead off of, we can say what we want, is seriously diminished. My platform to lead off of is diminished from when I was a U.S. senator. That is just a fact. And so the question is when other people look around, other people that are good people, and I could give you the list, you know them. I mean, they're good people. They look around and say, well, geez, if I push back on this, I might not be able to help veterans, or I may not be able to help agriculture, or I may not be able to help, do other things out there. And so they say it's just not worth it. Now, do I agree with that? Hell no. I think you get there because you've got a set of values you run on, and you want to fight for your state. Now, and that's the other thing. We got a bunch of senators. They're not fighting for their state anymore. They're fighting for Washington. When the hell did that ever happen? And so it's just kind of crazy. It's just, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for the people who push back, but most of them aren't there anymore.
Well, so the answer with where you started was what can people do? Again, it feels to me like the piece that so many people are missing in this moment, and in part because the mainstream media has not been covering it, is the extraordinary power that is waking up among the American people, as it did in the 1850s, as it did in the 1890s, as it did in the 1930s, as it did in the 1960s, and tapping into that is obviously that something that has is building careers around the country for people who are not otherwise terribly well known. So I pulled out a couple of former representatives, but they're state governors all over the country doing the same thing. But one of the pieces here is for Americans and American voters who perhaps did not show up in 2024 or felt apathetic in the past to make it more painful to ignore them than it is to ignore Donald Trump. And by that, what I mean is that I always say to people, you can complain all you want, and no, you're probably not going to change Ken Paxton in Texas, for example. But you are going to change somebody like James Tallarico, who's in the Texas legislature right now, and he is speaking very forcefully for the people of Texas. And the next generation is listening, and that's how you change things. And I can prove that because in 1884, when the Republican Party nominated James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, to become president, there were two members of the Republican Party who tried desperately to get the party to turn away from Blaine, but when they went with him, they stayed in the party anyway and tried to reform it from within. And that was Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt, who managed to get very deeply enough within the party that when they got power, they turned it from the old robber baron party to the progressive Republicans of the early 20th century. And, anybody looking around them right now says if you don't take on climate change and common sense gun reform, you've lost anybody who's under 45 years old, and most people who are under 60. And those are just things that are going to have to be addressed by new people coming up. So I'm all about continuing to speak up and putting pressure on people.
Yeah, look, I want to make this clear. I got to ask my last question, but I want to make this clear before I do this. I think you're right, by the way. I think people who stand up and say, this is wrong and here's why it's wrong, and lay out their case for reality, I think in the end will be able to keep their position if enough of them do it. The reason they've been able to pick off the Cheneys and the Kinzingers and others is there's not enough of them. But if they're willing to stand up and fight, and there's more of them, I think they win. I think it increases their ability to be effective United States senators or Congress people, whatever you want to say. So I agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying I can see why they may not want to do this. I've got to run here in a bit, but my last question is we talked about all these things people need to do. What do Democrats need to do to be able to put themselves in a position where people say, "Yeah, I like what they're saying." Number one, number two, they're right, and by the way, the current administration is not right. What do Democrats need to do?
Well, I think they need to keep speaking up. I hear this a lot that the Democrats seem hapless, and to some degree, some of our electeds do seem that way, in part because they're trying to keep the wheels on the bus, and that takes a lot of effort. But it always jumps out to me that people complain about the Democrats when, in fact, the Republicans have defined the Democrats. So you hear, for example, in 2024, you hear, well, the Democrats should have thrown identity politics off, overboard. In fact, um, Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota never talked about identity politics. They talked about this kind of government that would support communities and would support people regardless of gender, religion, race, ethnicity, and so on. But the media continually repeats that Republican narrative, the same way that they're doing, to bring it back to LA, the same way that they're doing in LA, where there have been headlines today that talk about how the troops are responding to riots in LA, when in fact it was the other way around. The troops went in and caused pushback, or not troops, but law enforcement officers. So the Democrats need to speak up and define themselves. But I am not one who is concerned about all the voices we've got. I think it's really good to have a number of different leaders who are speaking up and highlighting different things, because those will, as they did in the 1850s, come together into a new popular message. And right now, we should have all these different voices saying different things. And to that end, I'm going to twist your arm to do more events with me about Western lands, because people do not understand what's happening to the Western lands. And that is, I think, a message that would go far and wide if
Mhm.
two rural people like you and me spoke up about it.
Heather, yeah, I'll accept that date. I won't even tell my wife about it. Okay, you
There you go.
have to tell your husband. Okay,
Senator Tester has to hop off, but we're
we
gonna
will
keep
do
this
that. We will
conversation
do that.
going.
Okay, that
Yes.
issue is really important,
Yes, it is.
particularly for the Westerners. Thank you.
For everybody.
Alright.
Good to
Thanks,
see you.
Senator.
See you later.
So Heather, you pulled on so many things that we wanted to keep talking about, and we actually did an entire podcast episode about public lands with former BLM director Tracy Stone Manning, another Montanan, and it is so important. But I want to get back to what's happening in LA right now, especially when we compare the images we saw this weekend with the imagery of these tanks being moved to DC for this military parade, and a lot of people using the term authoritarianism. So, what what moment in history do you most compare this to in our history, and how do people who are concerned about what they're seeing actually say enough without going down and being in the middle of tear gas and these military interventions?
Well, there's a lot there, what you just started with. So, one of the things just to remember, I guess I'll start in a funny place, and that is there are people in the United States who I think consider themselves center or center left, who assume that the military and law enforcement officers, including immigration and customs enforcement, are firmly in the MAGA camp. And while there certainly are people in those institutions that are MAGA, in fact, the military has its own long history of supporting the Constitution, and it has its own rules and even laws for not fighting against American citizens. And similarly, if you've been reading around Reddit, for example, or other places where people are referring to ICE officers, their morale is really low right now because they really thought they were the good guys getting rid of rapists and murderers, the way Trump said. And now they are literally tearing families apart with children clinging to their parents' legs. So that idea that Trump has now control of the country as a military dictator, I just think it's not right. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying we are absolutely not there yet. I see these attempts of his to assert dominance as a sign of weakness, not of strength. And so to continue to push back on those things and to recognize that screaming about how powerful he is and playing into violence is exactly the game he wants to play right now. He doesn't want to talk about the tariffs that are badly hurting the economy. He doesn't want to talk about the fight with Musk and the fact Musk clearly knows stuff about him, aside from the Epstein files, which are bad enough for his base, which believed in the idea of, this ring of people that were pedophiles that were preying on children. In fact, that's pretty much what the Epstein files are, right? And now you got Musk saying Trump's in them. That's not really news. But I always thought that was a sign that Musk was warning Trump, I know a lot about you, because of course they actually were engaged in what sure looks like a criminal enterprise. He doesn't want us thinking about that. He doesn't want us thinking about that omnibus bill, the budget reconciliation bill, which cuts over the course of 10 years, almost $8 billion from Medicaid. And if you think that's only going to hit people who are engaged in fraud, I got a really nice bridge to sell you. So he's trying to get rid of all of the things that really are concerning Americans. So we divide into, yes, these people are terrorists and the law enforcement has to come after them. In fact, the argument that we want to have is this is not the government that responds to the needs of ordinary Americans, which is what we thought we were electing in 2024. So keeping that in mind and continuing to emphasize American values and personal values, I think is important in this moment.
And I think you make some really good points here about LA. I mean, I was watching some of the live coverage last night, and there was one reporter who was going live and saying that nobody's staying peaceful, everybody's violent. And this other reporter on the same network fact checked her live and said, actually, that's wrong. I'm seeing blocks and blocks of people who are sitting down. They're just out here peacefully protesting. And I do think that is something we need to pay attention to. I've been a reporter for a long time. We go to these scenes, and you can't possibly show the full scope of something, and your camera automatically goes to what's considered sexy or destructive or, an incredible image. And that, of course, is going to be a car on fire. But you're not just going to sit a camera focused on blocks and blocks of people sitting down peacefully. So I think that is one thing that people need to pay attention to. But I loved also in your newsletter, in your letter last night that you wrote about, we know that this flood the zone strategy is real. Steve Bannon has talked about it. Just continue to put out so much that people can't possibly stay engaged. And you made this point in last night's letter about this bipartisan immigration bill that had people on both sides ready to go. And it was President Trump, then candidate Trump, who said, no, I need to campaign on this. And that's a really, I think, a critical piece to remember in all of this.
Yes, and I'm not going to give you the whole thing off the top of my head now because it's been a while since I worked on it. But we have a long history in this country of immigration, especially immigration across the southern border. And in fact, one of the things I always think is interesting is when people talk about how, we need to get rid of migrant workers in the agricultural industry because those should be American jobs, which you hear on the right even today. One of the things that always jumps out is that when we developed agribusiness in the 1890s, for various reasons, including at the time the lack of real wells in the West, they always, always depended on migrant labor. That is literally how our agricultural system developed. It depended on cheap migrant labor. Now, it wasn't all Hispanic labor at that time. It was often Japanese labor and also Euro-American labor that went around to these places in agribusiness. But if you're going to change that system, which people say they want to do, you're going to have to change the entire system. And that's going to mean our food gets a lot more expensive. But that whole system has been with us since at least the 1890s. And there used to just be a lot of back and forth across the border. And that changed in the 1920s, then in the 1960s, and now in the present. And since the 1980s, presidents of both parties have recognized that there's a huge problem because we have more demand for labor in the United States, migrant labor in the United States, than we have legal places for those people to take. And so, people have been talking since the 1980s about fixing the system. And that's not the only time that we've come really close to fixing the system. There was also a system in place under John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He too refused to put it through because he wanted to keep the issue alive. So this idea somehow that this is a democratic open border, as Trump says, is simply the result of a couple of generations of Republicans wanting to keep that issue salient to convince their voters that somehow the Democrats are threatening them with migrants. And especially now that people like Viktor Orban in Hungary have turned it into a very effective way to create an authoritarian government, it's just infuriating to a historian.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure it is. And also to hear terms like insurrection being thrown around from Stephen Miller and the president himself after we just saw all of the January 6th defendants pardoned. And somebody posted yesterday, images of the protests in LA compared to what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. I wish Senator Tester was still here because he has a lot of thoughts about that day. He was in the building. What do you think about that term being thrown around here when we just saw all of those people pardoned?
You know, I was just saying to someone this morning, I do not understand why people still listen to the members of this administration and take what they say at face value, because they have been lying nonstop since they took public view as politicians. So when you hear them talking about what is happening in Los Angeles as an insurrection and yet pardoning the people who attacked the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, to overturn the lawful results of an election, what you're seeing is this attempt to redefine reality, to say our reality is the one that matters here. And that is absolutely what authoritarians do. Now, what's interesting in this moment, though, that makes it different than in America in the 1850s, for example, which you saw a very similar thing among elite enslavers in the American South, or than you saw in the rise of Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany, is that people have cell phones, they can record things, and they can exchange information really quickly in a way that you couldn't in the 1850s when the elite enslavers shut down all methods of communication that didn't honor their version of reality. So in LA, for example, you are seeing not only the burning car, if you will, or the fires, which appear to have been set by the flashbangs and the tear gas canisters. You're also seeing people saying, wait a minute, I'm in a line dance over here. Or something that I found very effective. If you have never been to LA, you don't know how big it is. It's huge. The LA County is bigger than most states, not in their geographical space, but in the number of people there. And somebody putting on social media, just free, so those of you who don't know LA, the places that they're talking about are actually really, really small, that you would not know this was happening. And that's not, as I say, going to fly with the MAGA people, the true MAGA people, at least the ones I know. But for a lot of people, it's like it matters when somebody like Kai Risdall, whom people know from Marketplace, say, this is a lie. This is not where I'm living at all. Or people who know cities and say, New York City is not a hellhole. New York City is a lovely town. And here's a news flash. Those of us who live in the country recognize that people in cities have no monopoly on crime and or on drug use or any of the other things that are associated in certain minds with urban areas. So that ability to say things quickly and to push back quickly and to have ordinary people pushing back, I think is really important in this moment. Just as I said, the idea of taking a short video and saying, this is why I care about Noah, because I don't want my husband out with waves that high, or because, this is why I care about NIH, because I've fought cancer for 8 years and they're cutting my program. That sort of real person reporting is going to be really important to push back against that false narrative that the administration is pushing.
Somebody asked me last night, do you think what we're seeing happening in LA and all of these threats? Do you think that this is just the administration throwing more spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, like some kind of test of the American people? What do you think about that question?
I absolutely think it's spaghetti at the wall. That's not to say it's not dangerous as can be, because the whole point is to keep testing things and to see what happens. But this is not over. And one of the things that worries me is the number of people who will say, "Oh, it's always been a fascist country. They're fascists. They're in control." In fact, this administration is terribly, terribly weak. It is underwater on every issue, and it did not have a majority of voters even in 2024. More people voted for somebody other than Donald Trump than voted for him. And if you look at the policies that they're putting into place, those are wildly unpopular. The tariffs, the Department of Government efficiency cuts, the immigration crackdowns that are taking people who are here in the country legally. All of these things are really unpopular. So, sort of throwing up your hands as they would like us to do and saying we're done is absolutely the worst thing to do. Now, as I keep saying, and I think you mentioned it, it's gonna be a bad summer. They're gonna continue to test, it's gonna continue to be hard, but there are more than 330 million people in this country. Sure. And if we organize, uh, and push back against what this administration is doing, we will win, and we can build a much better country than we had and have had now for decades.
Yeah, I know you've said part of the reason I think that so many people love you is because you deliver all of this information in a way that is really calm and grounded. And I know one of the things you said recently was like, isn't it cool that we get to write the story of the reawakening of American democracy? And I think that's a really hopeful message as we kind of process everything that's going on. But I want to ask you about something else that, of course, the whole Elon Musk Trump feud took over all of the headlines at the late end of last week. But one of my friends and former producers who grew up in Poland, he wanted me to talk about this. And this was about this codependent relationship and how it compares to what we've seen in Russia, with this codependent relationship and oligarchs falling in favor with the leader, getting favors until something happens, and then all of a sudden they're investigated or they're imprisoned. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that in a way that we can kind of all understand, so that we don't lose sight of that whole situation and what's really at stake with the fallout there.
This is really interesting, I think. So start with something that people don't talk about enough and it's important to remember. Both of the characters in that feud, Donald Trump and Elon Musk, are extraordinarily unstable. Like, that matters. So Trump has mentally slipped dramatically since the 1980s. He is slipping more every day. People tend to forget that because he is now the president of the United States and they have him under really close wraps. The White House is no longer posting transcripts of anything he said. They're doing clips, video clips, because when you actually have transcripts, you recognize he's completely all over the map, unable to answer a question, rambling. He sounds like somebody who needs to be in care. And we also know that Elon Musk is very, very erratic at best. We know that there are reports of very heavy drug use on the campaign. There are not reports of heavy drug use after the campaign, but anybody who's watching him certainly has reason to think he looks like people did in college, to me anyway, right? Even at things like the inauguration. So you got to start with the idea these guys are both really unstable. One is very powerful, one is very wealthy, but neither one of them have, until at least Trump got into office a second time, have stable incomes. That is, they are both dependent on the US government in order to maintain their positions. Okay, so we have that going on too. Now here's the other piece though. And that I think is I mean, I can tell you more about that, but one of the things we don't talk enough about in this country is that democracy and the rule of law is crucial to the protection of property. That's actually one of the key reasons that the people who declared independence from England did so, is because when the leader of a country can arbitrarily decide who gets to keep their property and who doesn't, you no longer have any confidence in your ability to amass a fortune. And that's one of the things we've seen since the 1980s, when we've seen more than $50 trillion move from the bottom 90% of Americans up to the top 1% of Americans, is the establishment of extraordinary fortunes. Now, if we get rid of the rule of law, we lose those fortunes. And I think that's one of the things, not we, I'm sorry, the people who have those fortunes lose those fortunes. And I think that's one of the things that the fight between Musk and Trump has shown, is that for wealthy people who are supporting or supported Trump, is that he could go after them the same way he went after Musk. And he said, listen, we're going to look at your government contracts. Also, that same day, and I thought this was really interesting, they opened an investigation, at least it looked like it was the same day, into Pete Hegseth's use of Signal. And that was interesting because Hegseth had been working with Musk. Remember when Musk was going to have the top secret stuff on China, information about what America would do if it went to war with China? That was Hegseth. And so there is this sense all of a sudden of people who might have thought that Trump was going to deregulate and they weren't going to get the high taxes that people like Vice President Kamala Harris threatened and so on, suddenly recognizing that this whole idea of getting rid of the rule of law is not such a ducky idea. So, and you can also see, Musk trying to back off and Trump saying, I'm not going to let you back off and so on. I think there's a lot going on there. And it's not just about those two men. It's about control of the Republican Party and about control of whether or not we will continue to support the rule of law. And that's how that plays out is going to be really interesting. I don't know anybody, though, who thinks it's a good idea to hand all that power over to Trump, not least because once you've done that, who's going to follow him? And you see this, I think, a lot with the major law firms that knuckled under to Trump, who are now losing clients and are losing their partners who are starting their own law firms to say, we're going to stand up to Trump. So that, too, I think, is a sort of systemic weakness in the Trump administration that is way bigger than just these two guys sniping at each other on social media, which, by the way, was juvenile as hell.
Yeah, and while it was entertaining, I appreciated your comments about how dangerous it is and what's at stake and all of the impacts we could see come out of that. But I think what another thing we need to mention is media and kind of they're capitulating, some of these bigger organizations capitulating to the Trump administration. And I know a lot of people are really, really upset about that. And meantime, we have news deserts that are growing, and we have more journalists getting laid off every single day. I was one of them in November. And how do we build that back so that is this the answer, kind of what we're doing here, and more of this independent journalism to go forward to shed light on these issues and just hope that the people come along with us?
Oh, I don't think we have to hope. Yes. And I don't think we have to hope that the people come along with us. I think they are along with us. We have 25,000 people watching us right now. Could you turn on your camera when you were with a major network and have 25,000 people just jump on board to watch what you had to say? This is not, again, a historian here, guilty, right? This is not unprecedented in the sense that in the late 19th century, the major media outlets really were captured by what we would nowadays call the robber barons. And what we got out of that was, first of all, a set of everyday news that was so slanted in terms of partisanship that the divisions in the country seemed very, very high, although they really weren't. Similar to today, if you actually study the politics of the Democrats in the late 19th century and of the Republicans, they're not all that different. The robber barons, yes, but Americans in general were usually on the same page in a lot of different ways. It's also a time of extraordinary ferment, quite exciting ferment in a lot of ways that mirrors the present. But what you got out of that was the rise of new media. People forget nowadays, but we had literally hundreds hundreds of Black newspapers in the late 19th century. We got all kinds of new writers. We got all kinds of new voices in all kinds of new magazines, for example. And from that, we got the rise of an independent media and an independent fact based media. And it was based on that independent fact based media that had all these different perspectives that we got the rise of what became known as muckrakers, as people who were examining the people in power and saying, you know what? They suck. They're just taking everything for themselves. And that would be people like McClure's magazine, which I'm sure people have heard of. And that rise of new media is, first of all, what gave us the idea of a media that was fact based. It gave us all sorts of new kinds of outlets. And it ultimately gave us a regrounding in American democracy. So when I look at the numbers of people who are engaged in independent media now, some of whom are investigative journalists, some are historians like me, some of my favorite people are just women who've lived really interesting lives. I look at that and I think, this is really where the beating heart of America is right now. And you know where I think you can see it? I think you can see that major media figures have made that leap, sometimes sort of seeming like they offended their employers deliberately, um, to independent media and have been quite successful there. And that I think is enormously hopeful. And when you talk about news deserts, yes, they're terrible. And yet, local independent media has taken off. It's reporting fabulous stuff. And we've got all these new journals like Wired, 404 Media, the ones covering the tech stuff. You know, I would not have had access to that 4 years ago. Now I can be cutting edge in reading about tech. So I think this is the future of journalism right now. I think that's changing very rapidly. It's not going to be sustainable for all of us to be out here doing this. And I suspect we will consolidate at some point, the same way people did in the early 20th century. But I don't see I think this, the loss of the big name newspapers is very sad. And it's a reflection of a change in the media industry and the overcapitalization of the industry and so forth and so on. It's not just that they're being bad guys. But I see this rebirth of news as being hugely important, maybe the important story of the last 4 or 5 years.
Oh, I really appreciate that. And we had Governor Tim Walz on our podcast. Gosh, I think it was a week or two ago now. It's hard to keep track of time these days, but he was saying the same thing, that people like him need to go out and connect with people on platforms like this. And I think that is a really smart political tactic and just ways to get your messaging out. But I want to, for people who are hopping on here who don't know, I'm Maritza Giorgio. I co-host a podcast with former Senator John Tester of Montana. And one thing that we talk about in our podcast pretty much every single week, in addition to Senator Tester asking why Congress isn't doing their job, we talk about Citizens United, and we talk about campaign finance reform, and that so much of why we even have Elon Musk working in the federal government, or he was working in the federal government, is because of that Citizens United decision. And we know there have been efforts to overturn that, but my goodness, it's been 10 years. So do you see that? Do you see a path to changing that?
We have to see a path to changing that. And I would go beyond Citizens United, which I think is 2010. Um, the The radical right has had a project now since the 1980s to cut back on democracy and to create what they call a unitary executive. And you can see this in the actions of the Supreme Court right up until within the last couple of weeks. The idea of cutting back the ability of Congress, for example, to create independent agencies and to give that power to the president. This idea that we don't like democracy because if you let people vote, they tend to vote for things that cost tax dollars. And of course, the US is way undertaxed compared to comparable other countries in the OECD, for example, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, which are our peer nations. We're not even at the average of taxes. We're like number fifth from the bottom. And if we actually were average, we would have several trillion more dollars in our budgets through tax revenue. But they began in the 1980s to try to preserve the idea of tax cuts and deregulation that Reagan had embraced by quite literally suppressing the vote. And we have had voter suppression measures in place in the United States, obviously way back in our history, but after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they started again in 1986. And they've gotten stronger and stronger, especially after the election of Barack Obama. And with the election of Barack Obama, there was this sense that really there was a problem because no matter what the Republicans had said, no matter how hard they talked about Democrats being communists and all that, people still chose, excuse me, to put a Democrat in power. So in 2010, first of all, we get Mitch McConnell, who was then at the head of the Republicans in the Senate, saying that he was not going to let Obama get anything through, and you probably remember that. But then in 2010, we get Citizens United, which opens up the floodgates of corporate money to flood the zone to convince people to vote against the Democrats. That was quite literally what was at the heart of that decision. But then in 2013, I'm sorry, also in 2010, we get Operation Red Map. And Operation Red Map was the Republican redistricting majority project, which took over state legislatures to make sure that the Republicans were in power after the gathering of the 2010 census, so that they could gerrymander states so that Republicans would be way overrepresented in those states. And then in 2013, we get Shelby v. Holder, the Shelby County versus Eric Holder decision, which guts the Voting Rights Act. And then, of course, that's been further gutted since. So what we got during the Barack Obama administration was the attempt of the Republicans to skew the system really dramatically in their favor. And you see this even now. If I read one more article after an election about why Black people didn't show up to vote, I'm like, do we just forget about voter suppression every time that there's an election? Um, all of those things must be corrected. And the reason I say that is not even about partisanship, it's about the concept of democracy. Because if people don't believe that they can have an effect on who governs them in a democracy, which after all is guaranteed in our Constitution and was enumerated in the Declaration of Independence as one of the fundamental human rights of people who were going to be living in the new country they hadn't yet constructed, if they no longer believe in that system, they have two options. They can turn apathetic and put up with whatever the party in power says. And we've certainly seen that in our history in the past, or they can be forced to put up with the party through violence, as happened in the American South from about 1874 to 1965, or they can revolt. And when they do that, in either case, you have extraordinary instability. And that instability is going to lead to the lack of property owning, of course, which is of interest to people on the radical right. But it's also going to lead to death and to real destruction. And this is why people like democracies. They like the rule of law. They like stability. They like medical science. They like education, simply because it means you don't have to think about the crap that we're having to think about every freaking day these days. And you can do things like plant your garden and trust that your children are going to be able to come home safely from school. So if we don't take those things on, we are going to lose our democracy, regardless of what happens with the Trump administration. And I would just, suggest in a moment of hope here, we tend in the United States to amend our Constitution in waves. We have not had a wave in quite a while. And there's a lot of what's been going on in the radical right Republican Party, which is not your mother's Republican Party, that overturns norms that we thought were established. It will not be difficult to put those into the Constitution or to pass laws, for example, that get rid of gerrymandering, which is unpopular in all political parties. It's in place because of a handful of politicians. So we're just simply going to have to do it.
So, with all the crap, as you say, that's coming at us all day long, how do you stay calm? How do you stay grounded? What do you do to just relax and unwind after consuming all of this and informing all of us every single day?
Well, I do have to exercise every day. But for me, and this is actually a problem for people, I think, for me, understanding is key. I feel like if you don't understand something or if someone is lying to you, that nothing makes me angrier because ultimately, if you're going to make good decisions about your life, you must have facts on the ground so that you react adequately to whatever's in front of you. You can't have a business with somebody who's lying to you because you'll make bad decisions. And so for me, figuring out what happened is calming. I need to know what happened. So last night I wrote about the events in LA and it took me forever. I finished at 4 o'clock in the morning, which I hate, but I didn't understand. I needed to know as close as I could, and I'm sure there are errors in it because we don't know yet. There's gonna be a lot more information coming at us for the next generation before somebody can write the definitive account. But if you just read the newspapers, they all said something slightly different. So I spent 8 hours, 9 hours simply reading accounts so that I could get a timeline. Because once I had a timeline, then I had a better sense of who was doing what. And so for me, that act is really calming. But what I always forget is that if other people don't react that way, so I put down, you know, something that to me is like, okay, now I understand because now I understand this. And here's the places I can push back, which I will say, but I won't put in the letters because the letters are a record. And then people are like, oh my God, now I can't sleep. So I've actually started putting sleep warnings on Facebook to say, if this one's safe and this one's not. But to me, just understanding makes all the difference in the world.
Oh, I think it's a great point, but sleep warnings are probably a good idea because I know a lot of people are losing a lot of sleep right now. I want to talk to you though about your new project because I know I can't keep you here forever, even though as much as I would like to. You have this new project out. I want to make sure we talk about it. You've said you were inspired by conversations that you've had about how to make our history more accessible so people can do what you just talked about and understand why we're here, especially as we see these lessons of history repeat themselves. So tell us about the journey to American democracy. How can we access it, and why do you want people to go access it like right now?
So we talk so much about history, and American history is so short. Compared to China. Everyone always says to me, "How do you know so much?" I'm like, "You should talk to my colleagues who do Chinese history." Because it's like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. And when I say American history, by the way, I'm talking about the history of the United States of America, because of course the history of on the North American continent is similar to China. It goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, right? But one of the things about having such a short history is that literally my great grandfather fought in the Civil War. This is like we cover a lot of history personally in our lifetimes because our country is so short. But what that means is that there's a lot of where we are now that you can go back to the touchstones of the Declaration and the Constitution and of our great heroes like Fannie Lou Hamer to say, democracy's always been a work in process. That's the whole point. We never get it right. Once you get it right, like what are you going to do next? You're going to mess it up. And we've never had it right. So one of the things that, as I say, is calming for me is to say, oh, this looks like the 1890s or oh, this looks like the 1850s. But that's not easy to do when lots of people don't know about the 1850s or the 1890s. And the stories are great. I love American history. That's what I do. So we were talking about how to get good history into people's hands. And I don't know about you, but my attention span these days is the length of a gnat's attention span.
Guilty. Yes, me too.
Well, and the other thing that always gets me is when people start to explain something and they tell you everything about this much, but then they don't give you any context for it. So I'm like a survey course person. I need to know the whole story And then I can do a deep dive. But like, don't tell me 650 million things about this much because I will not remember it. I call it the light bright theory of history, like those little light brights where you can't tell it's a boat until you fill in a lot of it. So when I say we, I mean me and my wonderful agent who is kind of behind everything I do, cheering me on and criticizing and all that. We wanted to do a series of short videos, and a friend of mine who's a Wall Street marketer said, numbers of 10, your survey course has to have 10 things in it that would be immersive so that when people are just scrolling, like I like to learn stuff, but I don't want to work too hard. So we wanted to do this, but we didn't know how what they would look like. And there was a lot of talk about putting my face on them. And I'm like, but it's not my history. And just at that moment, a former student who's become a videographer reached out and said, I really want to do something in this moment. Like, what do you have anything I could do? And I was like, I have a thought. So we've been experimenting for a long time. And we finally, and so the sound on the first set of 10 is a little rough because we did it over months. That is no longer the case. We had this idea to do these very short videos that covered a sweep of history or that covered something like the next one's going to be Juneteenth, just something that is in the news, but what the hell is it? And the idea is before the 250th to really reinforce the idea that American history is about ordinary people governing themselves and pushing back against authoritarians. And so we just did I guess I shouldn't tip my hand on the next one, but the next one is the expansion of democracy, but it's not, I think, going to be what a lot of people are expecting to see. And I just think they're so much fun, even if nobody loves them. For me, they are such a vacation to be able to do history. And it's a real challenge because I have 200 words. That's it. That's as many words as I can have. 200 words to tell the story of the case of the first 10, the story of 1763 through 1776 in Boston and how we got through the battles of Lexington and Concord and Paul Revere and the Continental Congresses and all that. So it's like this game to see if I can make history come alive in these little tiny snippets. And then of course the videographer and her partner who does the sound make it come alive. And then I get to have these wonderful little presents in my email that say, look, Heather, here's, I'm not going to give you the names of the next one, but here's your surprise for the day. So I really hope they take off and
I
people
have
enjoy
no
them as much
doubt,
as I
though.
do.
People will love them. I have no doubt because people love you. And again, I go back to this idea of the reason people love you. I asked all kinds of people leading up to this conversation, like, tell me why you love Heather Cox Richardson. And so much of it is just about informing, and it's not sensational and it's not angry, it's calming, but also just explaining things in a way that is so easy to understand. And I think that like when I talk to my other journalist friends, we forget that people don't consume news like we do. People don't understand or remember every little thing about this policy or this progression like we do because we lived it, working as a reporter. And I think it's so important to be able to explain those things in a way that is not condescending and not what's the word I'm looking for? Intimidating, but really accessible and just having a conversation. And I think you just nail that every single letter you write.
Well, the truth is I'm still a toddler at heart. Like, I'm still a 3-year-old. If there has been any success in anything I've done, it's that I never am shy about asking questions because I think the world is fascinating and I think people are fascinating. But what that means is that, I often, yeah, am willing to say, you know, honest to God, here's my thing. I have to look up the G20 every single time I write about it. What is the G20? Who are those people? And, I don't pretend like I know stuff I don't because I'm really interested in how it comes out. So, it's lovely that it works for people, but I think it is mostly that I never grew up. And you all owe Buddy who has to live with me. He's like, he's got to put up with me going, wait a minute. Like the other thing yesterday was I woke him up because I was like, okay, I have to ask. And of course, if your wife wakes you up, I don't know what he was prepared for. I said, is a possum the same thing as an opossum? And he's like, yes, Heather, a possum is the same thing as an opossum. We can go back to sleep now.
I love that though, and I think the really beautiful thing about being able to reach people on this platform and others is that we can just be authentically ourselves and we can admit things that we don't know and it's really relatable and I love that. I mean, I the possum opossum thing has got me for years, but I always come back to like you said, you never grew up and always ask people like how do you explain this to my 13-year-old? And it's changed every year he gets older. I used to be 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, but we really need to be able to understand these things. And with so much coming at us all the time, it's really hard to process that. So I just want to say thank you for everything you've done to help us do that.
Well, this is the great, as I say, the great fun of this moment for all the horror and all the exhaustion. And yes, I'm as exhausted as everyone else, is that, we're rediscovering American democracy as we must to move into the new era that we're facing. And yeah, I mean, of course, we all would like to live in a calm, easy time, but we don't get to choose that. I always think of the people who graduated from college in, 1941. They did not hope that they were going to go into another world war, which the world had just lived through one, but they did it. They had to do it, and we have no choice but to live through our own crisis and to put our mark on it. And it's fun to be doing it with so many really cool, interesting people who are recognizing their agency and speaking out and writing songs and putting up posters and marching and talking to their Congress critters and, you know, taking up oxygen, which is at the end of the day what democracy is all about.
So I just want to ask you one question because we asked some of our Grounded podcast followers what they want to hear from you. And I thought this was a really thoughtful question. Imagine you're helping prepare a future university history professor who will teach a class on the rise of Donald Trump to students in the year 2075. What are the major points you would want to make sure that are not forgotten about what's happening right now?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to forget because it's pretty obvious, but the use of language by the radical right in the United States, beginning in the 1980s, but really taking off in the 1990s when you had people like House Speaker Newt Gingrich literally distributing lists of words to use to describe Democrats versus Republicans. And the Democrats were words like traitor and weak and poverty, and the Republicans were things like patriots, strong, powerful. Um, Really taking off in the 1990s, and how that dovetailed with the use of language and what became known as virtual technology in the former Soviet republics, where people who were working in politics quite deliberately created a false reality in order to get people to vote away their democracy. And I think that because I study ideas, I think that control of people's minds through the use of certain kinds of rhetoric is really the story of America in this moment, and it has been building for a very long time. It's a mistake, I think, to look at Trump as as an individual who came from nowhere. He was built by this system and took advantage of it, and that central misuse of disinformation and that concept of disinformation and its dovetailing between the US and the former Soviet republics, and then its amplification through social media is, I think, the story of this era. And one of the reasons I think it's so important for those of us who are grounded in reality to push back. In many ways, we are fighting a war. It's just that it's a war in people's minds. And it's no accident that Alex Jones's tagline for InfoWars is that there's a war on for your mind. The good side is that we have reality and decency on our side, and we have woken up to the fact that we've got to use those things if we're going to preserve American democracy.
Okay, Heather Cox Richardson, I just want to say thank you so much. I love your idea of getting Senator Tester engaged in a discussion about public lands. I hope you'll come visit us in Montana. Maybe we could do that like in person.
I was in Montana a lot last year, and I would love to come back. In the short term, I'm writing a new book. And yeah, I'm just trying to steal all the time I can to write this new book. Because once you want to write a book, it burns a hole in your stomach. It's really funny because you finish a book and you're like, never again, never again. I'm never going to do this again. I always say this to my agent, and she's always like, right, okay, okay,
Uh-huh,
okay.
uh-huh.
And then in about a year, she's like, how you feeling? And I'm like, never. She's like, okay. Okay. But once you know what you wanna say, you are compulsive about it. So, once the draft is done, ask me again.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. I've just so enjoyed this, Heather Cox Richardson. And for those of you who didn't catch the beginning of this, I co host a podcast and Substack with former Senator John Tester of Montana, and he was on in the beginning. So if you missed that part, we will post this all to all the social media feeds. And we just so appreciate your time and being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. We'll talk
Thanks,
soon.
Heather. Okay, that sounds great. Thank you all.